Nobody remembers the exact time it happened, but everyone who was in that room remembers the silence that followed. It was a Thursday in October, the kind of afternoon when the world seems to pause between one season and the next, and the underwater viewing gallery at Meridian Ocean Park held only 11 visitors when the whale stopped swimming. She did not stop because she was tired. She did not stop because she was trained to stop. She stopped because she saw something in the glass, or perhaps through it, or perhaps reflected in it. And whatever she saw made her bring her enormous body to a halt so complete, so absolute, that the water around her seemed to stop moving. A child dropped his ice cream cone. No one noticed. No one could look away from her eye. Before this story continues, subscribe to the channel and like this video. You won't understand why until the very end. The year was 1992, and the world was different in ways that are difficult to explain to those who did not live through it. There were no smartphones capturing every moment, no social media spreading stories in seconds, no viral videos that could make an animal famous overnight. There were only moments, experienced fully, remembered imperfectly, carried forward by the people who happened to be present when something important occurred. Meridian Ocean Park existed in a coastal city that had seen better days, a city of faded boardwalks and rusting amusement rides, of motels with vacancy signs that never turned off, and restaurants that served the same fried fish they had served for decades. The park had opened in 1967, a monument to a certain kind of optimism, a belief that humans could bring the wonders of the ocean to people who might never see the ocean themselves. 25 years later, that optimism had faded like the paint on the entrance gates, but the park remained, stubborn and strange, drawing visitors who came for reasons they could not always articulate. The whale's name was Nora. This was not the name she had been born with, not the name her mother had called her in those first years of life in the Northern Pacific, but it was the name that had been given to her when she'd arrived at Meridian in 1979. And it was the name that appeared on the educational materials and the gift shop merchandise and the scripts that the trainers read over the loudspeakers before every show. She was an orca, though the park preferred to call her a killer whale, finding the name more dramatic, more likely to draw crowds, more aligned with the spectacle they were selling. She was 23 years old that October afternoon, which meant she had spent more than half her life in captivity, which meant she had been swimming in the same tank, breathing the same filtered air, seeing the same concrete walls for 14 years. The tank was called Pacific Encounter, a name chosen by marketers who understood that words could make anything seem grander than it was. In reality, Pacific Encounter was a concrete enclosure holding approximately 4 million gallons of chemically treated water, shaped in an elongated oval that allowed visitors to believe they were seeing something vast when they were seeing something that could be crossed in a matter of seconds by an animal built to travel 100 miles in a day. The underwater viewing gallery was the park's pride, its main attraction beyond the shows themselves. It had been built during a renovation in 1983. A response to changing tastes, a recognition that visitors wanted more than performances. They wanted intimacy. They wanted to feel close to the animals. They wanted to look into their eyes and believe that something was being exchanged. The gallery was a long corridor that curved beneath the main tank, its walls made of acrylic panels that offered a window into the underwater world. The lighting was dim, designed to make the blue glow of the tank more vivid, to create an atmosphere of mystery and wonder. Benches lined the walls for those who wanted to sit and watch. Educational plaques offered facts about orcas, their biology, their behaviors, their place in the marine ecosystem. Speakers played soft music, oceanic sounds, whale songs recorded somewhere far from this concrete box, meant to enhance the experience, to make visitors feel that they were somewhere other than where they actually were. On that Thursday in October, the gallery was nearly empty. The summer crowds had gone. The school field trips had not yet resumed their fall schedules, and the weather was too uncertain for casual visitors, clouds gathering over the coast, threatening rain that might or might not come. The 11 people in the gallery had come for different reasons, drawn by different circumstances, united only by the accident of timing that had placed them all in the same space at the same moment. There was a young mother with her son, a boy of perhaps 7 or 8 who had been begging to see the whales for months, and had finally worn down her resistance. There was an elderly couple, tourists from somewhere inland, checking items off a list of things to see before they returned home. There was a teenager, a girl with headphones around her neck and a notebook in her hand, skipping school for reasons she would not explain to anyone. There was a man in a maintenance uniform, on his break, eating a sandwich from the employee cafeteria. There was a woman, alone, middle-aged, standing very still in front of the largest panel, watching the water with an expression that seemed both empty and full. And there was Thomas Reeves, who would later become the one to tell this story, the one to carry it forward, the one who could not forget what happened even when he wanted to. Thomas was 34 years old, a middle school science teacher from a town 3 hours inland, visiting the coast for a conference that had ended early, filling time before his evening train by wandering through a marine park he had visited once as a child and barely remembered. He had no special interest in whales. He had no particular opinion about captivity or conservation or any of the debates that swirled around facilities like marine. He was simply there, present, occupying space, waiting for something without knowing what he was waiting for. Nora had been swimming when Thomas entered the gallery. She moved in slow circles, her massive body gliding through the water with an ease that seemed to contradict her size. Her dorsal fin, collapsed and curved to the left, marked her as a long-term captive. Though Thomas did not know this at the time, did not understand what that bent fin signified, did not recognize it as a symptom of something larger, he watched her pass the viewing panel, once, twice, 3 times, each circuit taking approximately 90 seconds, each pass offering a glimpse of her black and white patterns, her powerful tail, her pectoral fins spread wide for balance. There was something hypnotic about her movement, something that made Thomas forget about his train, forget about the conference, forget about the stack of ungraded papers waiting in his hotel room. He stood at the glass and watched, and time became strange, elastic, unmeasured. The change happened on her 4th pass. Thomas saw it clearly, would remember it for the rest of his life with a precision that surprised him. She was approaching the viewing panel from the left, moving at her usual pace, her body angled slightly downward as she navigated the curve of the tank. And then, without warning, she slowed. Not gradually, not in the way a swimmer might ease to a stop, but suddenly, as if she had encountered an invisible barrier, as if something in the water had changed and demanded her attention. Her tail stopped its rhythmic motion. Her pectoral fins adjusted, holding her in place. Her body rotated, orienting itself toward the glass, toward the gallery, toward the people standing on the other side. And then she was still. Thomas felt something shift in his chest. It was not pain, not exactly, but something adjacent to pain, something that pressed against his ribs and made breathing feel like an effort. He looked at her eye, that dark circle visible through the acrylic, and he felt seen in a way he had never felt seen before. Not watched, not observed, but seen, as if she was looking past his surface and into something deeper, something he kept hidden even from himself. The gallery had gone silent. The soft music still played from the speakers. The oceanic sound still rippled through the air. But no one was speaking. No one was moving. No one was doing anything except standing very still and looking at the whale who had stopped to look at them. The child dropped his ice cream cone. Thomas heard it hit the floor, a soft splat of melting chocolate and sugar. But he did not look, could not tear his eyes away from Nora's eye. The mother did not scold her son for the mess. She did not even seem to notice. She was staring at the glass with her hand pressed to her mouth, her body frozen, her eyes wide with something that was not quite fear and not quite wonder, but some strange mixture of both. The elderly couple had stopped their quiet conversation. The old woman had reached for her husband's hand, gripping it tightly, as if she needed something to anchor her to the present moment. The teenager had closed her notebook, her pen suspended in the air, forgotten. The maintenance man had stopped eating, his sandwich held halfway to his mouth, his jaw slack. The woman standing alone had not moved at all, but tears were streaming down her face, silent and continuous, as if something inside her had broken and was leaking out. Nora remained still. Her eye remained fixed on the gallery, on the humans gathered there, on something that only she could see or understand. Thomas tried to count the seconds, tried to measure the duration of this moment, but counting seemed impossible, irrelevant, absurd. Time had stopped, or changed, or revealed itself to be something other than what he had always assumed it was. He was standing in a marine park in a faded coastal city, watching a captive whale through a panel of acrylic, and he was also somewhere else entirely, somewhere that had no name, no coordinates, no place on any map he knew. Later, he would try to explain what he felt during those moments. He would sit in his kitchen at night, long after his wife had gone to bed, and he would write in a journal he kept hidden in his desk drawer, trying to find words for what had been wordless. He would write about recognition, about the sense that Nora had known him, had understood something about him that he did not understand about himself. He would write about grief, about the sudden and overwhelming sorrow that had washed over him as he looked into her eye and saw something trapped there, something vast and ancient and utterly confined. He would write about shame, about the realization that he was complicit in something terrible, simply by standing there, simply by having paid admission, simply by being a member of a species that did things like this, two creatures like her. But those words would come later. In the moment itself, there were no words. There was only the seeing and the being seen, the silence and the stillness, the strange communion that had no explanation and needed none. The moment ended, as all moments must. Nora blinked, a slow closing and opening of her eye that seemed deliberate, almost like a gesture, almost like a farewell. Then she turned, her massive body rotating in the water, and she resumed her circuit of the tank, swimming away from the glass, away from the gallery, away from the 11 humans who stood frozen in her wake. The spell broke. Time resumed its normal flow. Sound returned, and movement, and all the ordinary elements of ordinary life, but nothing was ordinary anymore. Everyone in that gallery knew it. Everyone felt it. Something had changed, and it could not be unchanged. The child began to cry, not about his ice cream, but about something else, something he was too young to name. His mother picked him up and held him against her chest, murmuring words of comfort that she did not quite believe. The elderly couple left the gallery without speaking, walking slowly toward the exit, their hands still clasped together, their faces pale and strange. The teenager opened her notebook and began to write furiously. Pages and pages of words that she would keep for the rest of her life, that she would show to no one, that she would read decades later and still not fully understand. The maintenance man threw away his sandwich, his appetite gone, and returned to work early, unable to stay in that space any longer. The woman standing alone finally lowered her hands from her face, wiped her tears with her sleeves, and walked to the nearest bench, where she sat for over an hour, staring at the water, waiting for something that did not come. Thomas stayed. He did not know how long. He missed his train. He knew that much, and had to book a hotel room for another night, had to call his wife and explain that the conference had run late, a lie that tasted bitter in his mouth. He stayed because he could not leave, because something held him there, because he needed to see Nora pass the glass again, needed to know if what had happened was real or imagined, needed to understand what it meant, if it meant anything at all. She passed many times as he stood there, but she did not stop again. She swam her endless circuits, her bent dorsal fin cutting through the water, her body moving with that same hypnotic grace, but she did not slow, did not turn, did not look at him with that dark, knowing eye. The moment was over. It had happened once and would not happen again. Thomas did not know whether to feel relieved or bereft. He learned about Nora in the days and weeks that followed. He visited the park's library, a small room near the education center that housed books and articles about marine mammals. He made phone calls to researchers, to activists, 2 former trainers who had left the industry and were willing to talk about what they had seen. He pieced together her story, or as much of it as could be pieced together from fragmented records and fading memories. She had been captured in 1978 off the coast of Iceland during a drive hunt that had rounded up an entire pod. She had been young then, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, swimming with her mother and her siblings, learning the roots and rhythms that her family had followed for generations. The capture had been violent, as all captures were, full of noise and chaos and separation. Her mother had followed the boat for hours, calling out, refusing to abandon her calf, even as the distance grew. Eventually, the mother had turned back. Eventually, the calls had faded. Eventually, Nora had been alone, in a tank on a ship, beginning a journey that would end at Meridian Ocean Park, where she would spend the rest of her life swimming in circles, performing tricks for fish, being watched by strangers who would never know her name. Her true name, the name her mother had given her in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. Thomas became obsessed, though he would not have used that word. He called it research, called it curiosity, called it a natural response to an extraordinary experience. He visited Meridian again, and again, and again, driving 3 hours each way, spending hours in the underwater gallery, watching Nora swim her circuits, waiting for another moment that never came. His wife noticed the change in him, the distance that had opened between them, the way he seemed to be looking at something she could not see. She asked him what was wrong, and he tried to explain, but the words came out wrong, sounded crazy, sounded like the ramblings of a man losing his grip on reality. How could he tell her that a whale had looked at him and changed everything? How could he explain that he was no longer the same person who had left for that conference? That something fundamental had shifted? That he was now carrying a weight he had not chosen and could not put down? The years passed, as years do, indifferent to the transformations occurring within individual human hearts. Thomas continued teaching, continued grading papers, continued living the life he had built before that October afternoon. But something was different. He started incorporating marine mammal topics into his science curriculum, teaching his students about intelligence and communication and the complex social structures of society. He started volunteering with conservation organizations, writing letters to legislators, attending protests at marine parks. He started talking to anyone who would listen about what he had seen in that gallery, about the moment when Nora had stopped and looked and changed everything. Most people nodded politely and changed the subject. A few understood. A few had their own moments, their own encounters, their own whales that had stopped at the glass and seen them. Nora lived for 11 more years after that October afternoon. Thomas followed her story from a distance, reading the occasional news article, calling the park periodically to ask about her health, always pretending to be a concerned visitor rather than what he had become, which was something closer to a witness, a keeper of memory, a person bound to an animal by a moment that should not have been possible but was. She continued performing until 1998, when her health began to decline and the park quietly retired her from shows. She spent her final years in a back pool, away from the crowds, away from the spectacle, swimming smaller circles in smaller water. She died in 2003 from a combination of factors that the park described as natural causes, but that Thomas understood to be the accumulated weight of a life lived in captivity, the slow wearing down of a body and spirit that had been built for something else entirely. He did not attend any memorial. There was no memorial. The park issued a brief press release acknowledging her passing, thanking her for her years of service, as if she had been an employee rather than a prisoner. Thomas read the release in his classroom during lunch while his students played outside, their shouts and laughter drifting through the windows. He read it, and he felt something break inside him, something that had been holding together through sheer force of will, and he put his head down on his desk and cried in a way he had not cried since he was a child. He cried for Nora, for her stolen life, for her endless circuit, for her eye that had seen so much and understood so much and been trapped behind glass for so many years. He cried for himself, for the man he had been before that October afternoon, for the innocence he had lost when she looked at him and showed him what he had not wanted to see. He cried for all of them, all the whales and all the tanks and all the marine parks around the world, swimming their circles, performing their tricks, waiting for something that would never come. The gallery at Meridian Ocean Park was demolished in 2011. The park itself closed 2 years later, unable to compete with newer attractions, unable to adapt to changing attitudes. unable to justify its existence in a world that was slowly, painfully beginning to understand what places like Meridian really were. Thomas drove to the coast when he heard the news, walked the empty grounds, stood in the spot where the gallery had been. There was nothing left, just concrete foundations and rusting pipes and weeds pushing up through the cracks. The tank where Nora had swum her circuits was drained, a massive empty pit filled with debris and rainwater. The bleachers where crowds had cheered were gone, removed by salvage crews, sold for scrap, or sitting in some landfill, slowly decomposing. Everything that had made Meridian what it was had been erased, as if it had never existed, as if those years of captivity and performance and confinement had been nothing more than a dream, a collective hallucination, a story that no one would believe. But Thomas believed. Thomas remembered. Thomas carried the weight of that October afternoon for the rest of his life, carried it into his retirement, carried it into his old age, carried it to the very end. He talked about Nora to his grandchildren, told them the story of the whale who had stopped at the glass and changed everything. He did not know if they understood. He did not know if understanding was possible for those who had not been there, who had not seen her eye, who had not felt the silence descend like a curtain between one world and another. But he told the story anyway, because stories are how we remember, how we honor, how we keep the dead alive in the only way we can. The other people in the gallery that afternoon scattered into their own lives, carrying their own memories, processing their own transformations. Thomas never learned their names, never tracked them down, never compared experiences with them, but he thought about them sometimes, wondered what had happened to them, wondered if they remembered the way he remembered, if they still saw Nora's eye in their dreams, if they still felt the weight of that moment pressing against their chests. He hoped they did. He hoped that the 11 of them, strangers united by accident and circumstance, formed some kind of invisible community, bound together by something that could not be explained but could not be forgotten. He hoped that Nora, wherever she was now, knew that she had mattered, that her moment of stillness had rippled outward through time, touching lives she would never know, changing hearts she would never see. In his final years, Thomas started writing, not the journal entries he had kept for decades, hidden in private, but something more public, something intended to be shared. He wrote about Nora, about Marie, about the underwater gallery in the October afternoon, and the 11 people who had stood frozen, while a whale looked at them and saw something. He wrote about captivity and freedom, about the lies we tell ourselves and the truths we cannot face, about the strange and terrible beauty of a creature confined to a space too small for her body, too small for her mind, too small for her heart. He wrote about love, the love that can exist between species, the love that transcends language and logic and everything we think we know about connection. He wrote about grief, the grief that never fully heals, the grief that becomes part of who you are, woven into your being like a thread you cannot pull without unraveling everything. He'd finished the manuscript 6 months before he died. He sent it to a small publisher that specialized in environmental writing, not expecting much, not caring much, satisfied simply to have completed the task, to have put the words on paper, to have done what he could to ensure that Nora would not be forgotten. The book was published posthumously, a slim volume with a gray cover and a title that Thomas had chosen himself, The Whale at the Glass. It did not become a bestseller. It did not make headlines. It did not change the world in any dramatic or visible way, but it found its readers, slowly, quietly, one by one. It found the people who needed to read it, the people who had their own whales, their own moments, their own silent encounters that had changed everything. It found them, and they read, and they remembered, and they passed the book on to others, and the ripples continued spreading, wider and wider, touching shores that Thomas would never see. In the final chapter, Thomas described returning to the coast one last time, to the empty lot where Meridian Ocean Park had once stood. He wrote about walking the grounds in the early morning, when the mist was rising and the seabirds were calling and the world seemed suspended between what was and what might be. He wrote about standing in the spot where the gallery had been, closing his eyes, seeing Nora as clearly as he had seen her that October afternoon, her body still, her eye fixed on the glass, her presence filling the space with something that could not be measured or named. He wrote about speaking to her, silently, in his mind, telling her that he was sorry, that he had tried, that he would never forget. He wrote about feeling, for just a moment, something like a response, something like a presence, something that might have been his imagination but felt like something more. And then he wrote the final words of the book, the words that would become his epitaph, the words that would outlast his body and his life and everything he had ever been. Some encounters cannot be explained. They can only be experienced. They change you not because you understand them, but because you allow them to move through you without resistance. Nora stopped at the glass on a quiet afternoon in 1992, and the room quietly changed. I was there. I saw it happen. I am still seeing it every day, every night, every moment of my remaining life. That is my story. That is her legacy. That is what it means to be witnessed by a creature who should never have been there, who should have been swimming free in the open ocean, who should have lived and died among her own kind, in waters we have never touched. She saw me. She saw all of us, and in seeing us, she showed us who we really are. The building that once housed Meridian Ocean Park is gone now. The land has been redeveloped, turned into something else entirely, something that bears no trace of what came before. People walk those grounds without knowing what happened there, without sensing the ghosts that linger, without hearing the echoes of a whale's slow breathing in the underwater silence. The world moves on, always, relentlessly, erasing and building and forgetting and beginning again. But somewhere, in the pages of a slim gray book, in the memories of 11 people who stood in a gallery on an October afternoon, in the ripples that continue spreading outward through time, Nora lives. She swims her eternal circuit. She slows at the glass. She turns her dark eye toward the humans watching her, and she waits. She waits for them to understand. She waits for them to change. She waits for the moment when the silence will break and something new will begin. If this story stayed with you, if that silence meant something to you, subscribe to the channel. These stories are not about animals. They are about us. Some memories do not need to be defended. They only need to be remembered.